I was halfway through my shift when the emergency exit alarm sounded for the first time. It wasn't loud enough to wake the entire building, but it was sharp enough to cut through the silence that settles over an office after midnight. I looked up from the security desk, expecting to see someone on one of the cameras, but every monitor showed the same empty hallways, dim lights, and rows of silent cubicles. Our company occupied 8 floors of a downtown office tower, and after 11 at night there were usually fewer than 10 people left in the building. Most of them were software engineers trying to finish projects before deadlines. I had worked a night shift for almost a year, and I knew everyone's habits. The accountants always left by 9. The cleaning crew started on the top floor and worked down. The engineers ordered food around midnight and complained about the air conditioning. Nothing ever happened, which was exactly why I liked the job. I reset the alarm from the control panel, assuming the old sensor had malfunctioned again, but less than 30 seconds later it went off a second time. This time I grabbed my flashlight and radio, before taking the elevator to the 7th floor where the emergency exit was located. The hallway was empty. The heavy metal door was closed and locked from the inside, just as it should have been. I pushed against it anyway, listening for footsteps on the stairwell beyond it, but heard nothing except the faint echo of the building's ventilation system. "Everything okay?" a voice asked behind me. I turned and saw Dylan, one of the software developers, carrying a cup of coffee. He looked exhausted. "Alarm keeps tripping," I said. "Did you use this exit?" He shook his head. "Been coding all night? Haven't left the office." He even laughed, saying if someone was sneaking around, maybe they could finish his project while they were at it. His joke eased the tension a little. I reset the sensor again, waited another minute, and when nothing happened I returned downstairs. By 1 in the morning I had almost forgotten about it. Then the phone on the security desk rang. It was the cleaning supervisor. "Is somebody working on floor 6? She asked. "No," I replied. "Why?" There was a pause. One of my cleaners said a man walked into the conference room. We thought it was an employee, but when we opened the door, nobody was there. I checked the camera covering that hallway. The conference room door remained closed the entire time. No one entered or exited. "Probably saw a reflection," I suggested, though I didn't sound convinced. "That's what I told her," the supervisor answered quietly, "but she refuses to go back in there." I decided to take another walk through the building. The 6th floor felt colder than usual. Motion-activated lights blinked on one after another as I walked through the hallway. The conference room was exactly as it appeared on camera. Chairs neatly pushed in, projector turned off, not a single sign that anyone had been inside. I searched every office, every restroom, every storage closet. Nothing. As I stepped back into the hallway, my radio crackled with static before a voice broke through. "Security. You copy?" It was barely understandable. "Go ahead," I answered. Only static replied. Then, through the interference, I heard what sounded like breathing, slow, deliberate, close enough that I instinctively looked over my shoulder even though the hallway was empty. "Who's transmitting?" I asked. Silence. Then the radio went dead. I returned to the lobby feeling more annoyed than nervous, convincing myself the old equipment was failing again. Around 2:30, a delivery driver arrived with food for one of the engineering teams. I let him in, watched him ride the elevator, and made a note in the visitor log. 10 minutes later, he came back down looking confused. "Wrong floor?" I asked. "No," he said slowly. "A guy told me to leave the food outside conference room B because he was in a meeting." "Which floor?" 6. My stomach tightened. There hadn't been anyone authorized to use that floor all night. I checked the order. It had been placed from an employee account that belonged to a manager who was on vacation in another state. Thinking someone had played a prank, I pulled up the hallway camera. The delivery driver appeared exactly where he said he had been. He placed the bag outside the conference room, knocked once, waited, then walked away. 20 seconds later, the bag slid out of the camera's view by itself. There was no visible person. No door opening. Just the bag moving sideways until it disappeared beyond the frame. I replayed the footage over and over, slowing it down until every second felt painfully long. The conference room door never moved. There wasn't a single shadow or reflection suggesting someone had reached out from inside. It simply looked as if the food had been pulled away by invisible hands, though I knew there had to be another explanation. Cameras have blind spots. Angles can be deceptive. I kept repeating those thoughts until I almost believed them. Almost. I went back upstairs immediately. The food bag was gone. The conference room was still locked, and when I unlocked it myself, the room was completely empty. No food, no people. No open windows. Just a faint smell of fresh coffee that hadn't been there before. Dylan was still coding on the 7th floor, and he swore he hadn't gone downstairs. The cleaning crew had already left the area. I stood in the center of the room trying to make sense of what I'd just seen when my phone vibrated with a notification from the building's security system. Someone had just used my employee access card to unlock the emergency exit on the 8th floor. The problem was, my access card was still clipped to my belt. The notification stayed on my screen long enough for me to read it 3 times before it disappeared. Emergency exit floor 8, access granted 2:47 a.m. Badge ID, Security 01, that was my badge. I unclipped it from my belt and turned it over in my hand as if I expected to find another card hidden behind it. There wasn't one. I called the monitoring company to ask if the system could log the wrong badge number during a software glitch. The technician told me it was possible but extremely uncommon and suggested I inspect the door before assuming the log was inaccurate. I thanked him, hung up, and immediately regretted not asking him to stay on the line. The elevator ride to the 8th floor felt unusually slow. Every mechanical sound seemed louder than normal, and I found myself watching the floor numbers instead of the doors, almost hoping someone would stop the elevator before it reached the top. No one did. When the doors opened, the hallway was empty. The emergency exit was at the far end beside a storage room that was rarely used. My flashlight swept across the polished floor, catching nothing but reflections. The exit door looked completely normal until I reached it. It wasn't fully closed. It had stopped just short of latching, leaving a gap no wider than a finger. That shouldn't have been possible because the hydraulic closer usually slammed it shut on its own. I pushed it open and stepped into the concrete stairwell. The air smelled damp, mixed with cigarette smoke that seemed fresh even though smoking wasn't allowed anywhere inside the building. "Security," I called. "If someone's here, identify yourself." My voice echoed down the stairwell before fading into silence. I listened carefully. At first there was nothing. Then I heard footsteps somewhere below me. Slow, deliberate, one step every few seconds. They stopped the moment I started moving toward the railing to look down. The stairwell stretched all the way to the parking garage, each landing visible under harsh fluorescent lights. I couldn't see anyone. I radioed downstairs, forgetting I was the only security guard on duty. Habit made me do it. The empty static that answered reminded me just how alone I actually was. I descended one flight, then another, checking each landing. Nothing. The footsteps never returned. By the time I reached the sixth floor, I was beginning to feel ridiculous. Old buildings make strange noises. Pipes expand. Doors shift with changes in air pressure. I had explained those things to nervous employees more times than I could count. It was harder to convince myself now. As I turned back toward the lobby, I noticed something wedged under the handrail on the fifth-floor landing. It was a folded receipt from a coffee shop across the street. The timestamp showed 2:32 a.m., barely 15 minutes earlier. Someone had been in the building recently enough to buy coffee during my shift. Written across the back in black marker were 3 words, "Don't trust Dylan." I stared at the message, immediately thinking it had to be some kind of joke. Dylan was still upstairs working on software updates. I had spoken to him twice already that night. He seemed tired, maybe a little distracted, but nothing about him suggested he was dangerous. I slipped the receipt into my pocket anyway and headed back toward the elevator. When I reached the 7th floor, Dylan's office was empty. His laptop remained open, code covering the screen, and his coffee was still warm enough to produce steam. He hadn't signed out, and I hadn't seen him leave. Assuming he had gone to the restroom or another office, I checked the nearby rooms, empty. Then I reviewed the hallway camera from my phone. It showed Dylan standing from his desk exactly 4 minutes earlier. He walked toward the hallway, looked directly into the security camera for several seconds without moving, then turned left and disappeared into the stairwell. He never came back out. I replayed the footage, expecting to notice something I'd missed, but the part that bothered me most wasn't where he went. It was the expression on his face. He didn't look frightened. He looked as though he had just recognized someone standing behind the camera. I hurried to the stairwell entrance and pushed the door open. "Dylan!" I shouted. My voice echoed downward. No answer. I descended quickly, checking each landing. On the 4th floor, I found his coffee cup sitting neatly in the center of the concrete steps. It hadn't spilled a single drop. A few feet away lay his employee badge, as though he had intentionally placed both items there before continuing. My pulse quickened. I called his phone. I heard it ringing nearby but couldn't tell from which direction. After the 4th ring, it stopped abruptly. Then I heard another sound, a metal door closing somewhere below me. I ran down to the 3rd floor, then the 2nd, then finally reached the parking garage. The lights there were dimmer than anywhere else in the building. Long rows of parked cars cast deep shadows across the concrete floor. Dylan wasn't there. Neither was anyone else. My flashlight landed on a white maintenance van parked in a space reserved for contractors. It hadn't been there when I made my earlier patrol. I approached cautiously, checking the license plate. It was covered in dirt. There were no company logos on the side, only faded white paint. The rear doors were slightly open. Every instinct told me not to look inside, but I couldn't ignore it. I pulled one of the doors wider. The cargo area was almost empty except for a toolbox, several rolls of duct tape, a heavy flashlight, and a printed floor plan of our office building with multiple areas circled in red. Before I could study it further, my radio crackled to life with perfect clarity for the first time all night. A calm male voice spoke only one sentence. "He's already behind you." I spun around so fast that my flashlight slipped from my hand, and as it rolled across the concrete floor, its beam stopped on the shadow of a man standing only a few feet away, just outside the reach of the light. The flashlight spun in a slow circle before coming to rest against the tire of a parked sedan, its beam fixed on the concrete floor. The shadow I had seen was gone. For a second, I questioned whether it had been a trick of the light, but then I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving away between the rows of vehicles. I grabbed the flashlight and ran toward the noise, calling out that building security had already contacted the police. It was a bluff. I hadn't called anyone yet because, until that moment, I had been trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation for everything. Now there wasn't. The footsteps stopped. I swept the flashlight from left to right. Every parked car reflected the light back at me, creating dozens of bright flashes that made it impossible to focus. Then I noticed a service door near the loading dock swinging shut. I reached it just before it closed and pushed through into a narrow maintenance corridor that connected the garage to the freight elevator. The corridor was empty, but the freight elevator indicator showed it had just begun moving upward. I hit the call button repeatedly, knowing I would never catch it. Instead, I took the stairs, climbing as fast as I could while trying to control my breathing. By the time I reached the 6th floor, I could hear the freight elevator doors opening somewhere nearby. I eased the stairwell door open and looked into the hallway. The elevator stood open, empty. Across the hall, the conference room door, the one that had supposedly been locked all night, was slightly open. A thin strip of light stretched across the carpet. I approached quietly, every instinct telling me not to rush. Inside, the room looked ordinary at first glance. The missing food bag sat on the conference table, half empty. Beside it were disposable coffee cups, wrappers, and several printed copies of employee schedules. Someone had been using the room without anyone noticing. Spread across the table was the same floor plan I had seen in the van. Only this copy had handwritten notes identifying security camera blind spots, cleaning crew routines, delivery times, and shift changes. My own patrol schedule was highlighted in yellow. Before I could study it further, I heard the conference room door click shut behind me. I turned instantly. Dylan was standing there with both hands raised. His face was pale, and he looked more frightened than I had ever seen another person. "Don't yell," he whispered. "He's still here?" I demanded an explanation, and the words came out harder than I intended. Dylan glanced toward the hallway before speaking. A week earlier, while working late, he had noticed someone inside the building after everyone else had supposedly left. At first he assumed it was another employee, but the man never used a badge, never appeared clearly on cameras, and always vanished before anyone else arrived. Dylan reported it to building management, but after reviewing incomplete footage, they dismissed it as a misunderstanding. Instead of letting it go, Dylan began quietly documenting what he saw. The fake food order, he admitted, had been his idea. He wanted to prove someone was secretly occupying the building after hours. He hadn't expected the food to disappear without anyone entering the room on camera. The note warning me not to trust him had not been written by Dylan. Someone wanted us suspicious of each other. As he spoke, my radio suddenly transmitted a voice again, this time my own. "Everything looks clear," it said. Returning to the lobby, neither of us had made that transmission. The realization hit us at the same moment. Whoever was in the building had been listening to our radio traffic and replaying recordings to manipulate us. Dylan slowly pointed toward the ventilation grill near the ceiling. Hidden behind it was a tiny wireless speaker. We heard another sound almost immediately, a heavy door slamming several floors below. Whoever had planted the speaker knew we had found the room. We left together instead of splitting up. As we reached the lobby, we finally called the police and explained everything, including the suspicious van in the garage. Officers arrived within minutes, sealed the building, and conducted a systematic search. They eventually located a concealed maintenance storage area behind a false wall that had been created during renovations years earlier and forgotten in official building records. Inside were blankets, bottled water, stolen employee access cards, radio equipment, spare clothing, camera batteries, and notebooks filled with observations about dozens of workers who had stayed late over the previous several months. The white van belonged to a former subcontractor whose employment had ended almost 2 years earlier. Investigators concluded that he had continued entering the property through an unsecured service entrance, gradually learning every routine in the building while avoiding direct contact. He had become comfortable enough to move through offices after midnight, taking food deliveries, monitoring radio traffic, and watching employees who believed they were alone. What they never found was the man himself. By the time officers searched the garage, the van was still there, but its driver had disappeared. Detectives believed he escaped through an old utility tunnel connected to a neighboring structure, before the police established a perimeter. I resigned the following week. Dylan transferred to another office, and the company upgraded every access system, camera, and emergency exit. Months later, I thought the experience was finally behind me until I received a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was my original security badge, the one I had been wearing that night despite the fact that it had never left my possession and was locked in a drawer at home after I quit. Tucked behind it was a single photograph taken from somewhere inside the lobby. It showed me sitting alone at the security desk during one of my overnight shifts, completely unaware that whoever had been living inside the building had been close enough to take the picture. Written neatly across the back were 6 words that still keep me awake whenever I think about them. You only noticed me once I wanted you to.